just taken a job at a small old gas station on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much, but it paid the bills, and working the night shift meant fewer customers and more time to himself. The gas station was practically in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dense trees, and the highway running past it was always eerily quiet after dark. His first few nights were uneventful. He'd spend his shift restocking shelves, cleaning up, and occasionally helping the odd traveler who'd pull in for gas or snacks. But there was always something off about the place. It felt heavy, like the air was thicker than it should be. Sometimes he'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of his eye, shadows darting between the aisles or flickers in the security cameras. But it wasn't until his fourth night that things took a turn for the worse. It was around 2 a.m., and the station was dead silent. Tom was sitting behind the counter, flipping through an old magazine when he heard the faint sound of a bell. It was the kind of bell that rang when a customer opened the door, but no one had come in. He glanced up at the security camera feed. At first everything looked normal, but then he saw it. A figure standing just outside the gas station's door. The figure was tall, with long dark hair hanging over its face, and it was completely still. Tom's heart skipped a beat. He blinked, and the figure was gone. For the next hour, Tom couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time he checked the cameras, he half expected to see that figure again. But there was nothing, just the quiet gas station, dimly lit by the flickering neon lights outside. Just as he began to relax, the doorbell rang. This time, someone was actually there, a man in his mid-40s, dressed in a tattered jacket and worn-out jeans. His face was pale, his eyes sunken and lifeless. He shuffled in slowly, barely glancing at Tom as he walked toward the refrigerated drinks. "Can I help you?" Tom asked, trying to sound casual, but the man didn't respond. Tom watched as the man grabbed a bottle of water and walked up to the counter. He placed the bottle down, but as Tom reached for it, the man suddenly looked up, locking eyes with him. "You shouldn't be here," the man whispered, his voice raspy and barely audible. "Not at night." Tom froze. "What do you mean?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he slowly turned and walked out of the store, leaving the bottle of water behind. Tom watched him leave, but something about the way the man moved, so slow, so deliberate, made his skin crawl. He quickly locked the door behind him. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but Tom couldn't shake the man's words. "You shouldn't be here. Not at night." They echoed in his mind, growing louder with each passing hour. The next night, Tom arrived at the gas station a little earlier than usual. As he approached the front door, he noticed something strange. The lights inside were flickering. He hadn't turned them on yet. He stepped inside, his heart pounding in his chest. The station was completely empty, but the air felt colder than normal. As he walked toward the back to check the electrical panel, he heard a faint sound behind him, like someone whispering. He spun around, but no one was there. The security camera feed caught his eye, and his blood ran cold. On the screen, standing in the middle of the aisle, was the same figure he'd seen outside the store the night before. The long, dark hair still obscured its face, but now it was closer, almost as if it were staring directly into the camera. Tom's heart raced as he grabbed the flashlight from the counter and headed toward the aisle. But when he got there, it was empty. "Hello?" he called out, but his voice felt small, swallowed by the thick silence. Suddenly, the lights flickered off, plunging the station into complete darkness. Tom stood frozen in the pitch-black gas station, his breath caught in his throat. The flashlight in his hand flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the shelves. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing right behind him, watching, waiting. A loud thud came from the back of the store, followed by the sound of cans toppling over. Tom whipped the flashlight in that direction, but he saw nothing out of the ordinary. The shelves were lined with snacks and drinks, all perfectly in place. But he could feel it. There was something else in the store with him. He hurried back to the front counter, his hands trembling as he fumbled with the security system. The cameras had glitched again, showing only static and brief flashes of that dark figure. Suddenly, the doorbell chimed, and Tom's heart nearly stopped. He hadn't unlocked the door since the strange man had left the previous night. But when he looked toward the entrance, the door was wide open, swinging gently in the cold night breeze. Something was wrong. Very wrong. He sprinted over to the door and slammed it shut, locking it again. As he turned around, the whispering started. It was faint at first, like a distant voice carried on the wind, but it grew louder, surrounding him, filling his head. "You shouldn't be here." Tom clutched his head, his mind spinning. The words echoed louder and louder until they became unbearable, like a chorus of voices all around him. And then, as suddenly as they had started, the whispering stopped. The lights flickered back on. The next day, Tom couldn't get the events of the night before out of his mind. He needed answers. After his shift, he went to the local library to research the gas station's history. It wasn't long before he found something that sent chills down his spine. Decades ago, before the gas station was built, the land had been the site of a brutal murder. A family of 4 had been driving through the area when their car broke down. They sought help from a nearby farmhouse, but the farmer who lived there wasn't as kind as they had hoped. The details were hazy, but the story suggested that the family never left the farm. The house was burned down shortly after, and the gas station was built on the same land. Tom couldn't help but wonder if the strange events at the station were connected to this dark past. Were the spirits of the murdered family still lingering there, trapped on the land where they had met their gruesome fate? That night, Tom arrived at the gas station with a new sense of dread. He knew something wasn't right, and he wasn't sure if he could face it again. As the hours passed, the gas station remained quiet, but Tom knew better than to let his guard down. Around 3 a.m., the lights began to flicker again, and the familiar chill returned to the air. The doorbell rang. Tom froze, his heart racing. He slowly turned toward the entrance, but instead of seeing a customer, he saw the figure. The same one with the long, dark hair, standing just outside the door, staring directly at him through the glass. Tom didn't move. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on the figure outside, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The figure's hair slowly parted, revealing its face, pale, gaunt, and twisted into a grotesque smile. Without thinking, Tom grabbed the baseball bat he kept behind the counter and stormed toward the door. He swung it open, but the figure was gone, vanished into thin air. Suddenly, the whispering started again, louder and more frantic than ever. "You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't be here." Tom spun around, but the gas station was empty. The lights flickered violently, and the whispering grew into a deafening roar. "You shouldn't be here." Tom dropped the bat and clutched his head, his mind spiraling as the voices overwhelmed him. He stumbled toward the door, desperate to escape, but as he reached for the handle, the door slammed shut on its own. He was trapped. The figure appeared again, this time standing in the middle of the gas station, its twisted smile widening as it slowly approached him. "No!" Tom screamed, backing away. "Stay away from me!" But the figure kept coming, its footsteps slow and deliberate, the air around it growing colder with each step. Tom's heart raced, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he pressed himself against the wall. And then, just as the figure reached him, it stopped. The lights flickered once more, and the figure disappeared, leaving Tom alone in the cold, dark gas station. The whispering stopped. Tom collapsed to the floor, shaking with fear. He knew he couldn't stay there any longer. Whatever was haunting the gas station wasn't going to leave him alone. He had to get out. Without wasting another second, Tom grabbed his jacket and bolted out of the gas station, never looking back. The next morning, he called his boss and quit the job. The gas station could find another night shift worker. He wasn't going back. Months later, Tom had moved far away from the gas station, hoping to put the terrifying experience behind him. But every now and then, late at night, he would hear the faint sound of a doorbell ringing in the distance, followed by a familiar whisper in the wind. "You shouldn't be here." No matter how far he ran, the curse seemed to follow him. It was Maya's first week as a night security guard at the office building, a sleek modern structure that stood tall and silent after hours. Her job was straightforward: make rounds, check the security cameras, and ensure the building was secure until the morning shift arrived. The pay was decent and the hours weren't too bad, but something about being alone in that massive empty building at night made her uneasy. There was only one other person working the night shift: the janitor, an older man named Carl. He was a bit odd, always keeping to himself, never saying much. His eyes seemed to linger just a little too long whenever he passed her, his steps echoing eerily in the quiet halls. Maya shrugged it off at first, chalking it up to the awkwardness of the job. But soon she began to notice things. During her rounds, she'd often find doors that should have been locked wide open. Lights that she distinctly remembered turning off were suddenly on again. And the security footage, sometimes it would glitch, showing strange static-filled images that didn't make sense. One night, around 2 a.m., Maya was reviewing the camera feeds in the security room when she saw something that made her stomach churn. In one of the feeds, Carl was standing in the hallway near the storage room, staring directly into the camera. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching. His face was blank, expressionless, but his eyes, they seemed darker than normal, almost hollow. She blinked, and the feed glitched. When it came back, Carl was gone. The following night, Maya couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her. Every sound, every creak of the building seemed amplified in the stillness. Carl hadn't spoken to her at all since she'd started, but tonight, he seemed to be everywhere. She'd see him out of the corner of her eye while making her rounds, just standing in the shadows watching. Around 3 a.m., Maya decided to take a break. She made her way to the break room and poured herself a cup of coffee. As she sat down, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She could feel someone watching her. Turning slowly, she saw Carl standing in the doorway. He didn't say a word, just stared at her, his eyes cold and unblinking. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke, his voice low and raspy. "Busy night?" Maya forced a smile and nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to make small talk, but Carl didn't respond. He just continued to watch her with that same unsettling stare. "I'll be around if you need anything," he finally said before turning and walking away, his footsteps echoing down the hall. The moment he was gone, Maya felt a wave of relief wash over her. But something about the way he'd been watching her made her feel like she wasn't alone, like there was something more to Carl than just an odd, quiet janitor. By the fourth night, Maya was on edge. The strange occurrences were becoming more frequent. Doors that she locked would mysteriously unlock themselves. The lights continued to flicker and the security cameras were glitching more than ever. And Carl, he seemed to be everywhere, always lurking in the shadows. During her rounds, Maya noticed something strange. The door to the basement, which was always locked, was slightly ajar. She hesitated, feeling a cold shiver run down her spine. The basement wasn't part of her regular rounds, and she'd never been down there before, but her curiosity got the best of her. She grabbed her flashlight and slowly descended the stairs, the cold, musty air wrapping around her like a blanket of dread. The basement was dark and cluttered with old equipment and boxes, but there was something else, a faint light coming from a room at the far end of the hallway. Maya's heart pounded in her chest as she approached the room. The door was slightly open, and she could hear soft murmuring from inside. Pushing the door open a little further, she gasped. There, in the center of the room, was Carl. He was standing in front of a large old mirror, his back to her, muttering something under his breath. But what really made her blood run cold was the reflection in the mirror. It wasn't Carl. The reflection showed a tall, shadowy figure with hollow, glowing eyes staring back at her. It was dark, almost demonic, with long, twisted limbs and a sinister grin stretching across its face. Maya backed away slowly, Her breath caught in her throat. As she moved, the reflection in the mirror shifted. The shadowy figure's eyes locked onto hers, and Carl stopped muttering. He turned around slowly, his eyes now the same hollow, glowing orbs she had seen in the reflection. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice no longer his own. Without thinking, Maya bolted up the stairs, her heart pounding in her ears as she raced through the darkened halls. The sound of Carl's footsteps echoed behind her, faster and more deliberate now. He wasn't shuffling anymore. He was chasing her. She could hear his breathing, heavy and ragged as he closed in on her. Maya darted into the security room, slamming the door behind her. She quickly locked it and backed away, grabbing her radio to call for help. But the radio was dead. The lights in the security room flickered, and the cameras glitched, showing distorted images of the building's hallways. Carl was nowhere to be seen, but the shadowy figure from the basement was on every screen, creeping closer with each flicker of the lights. "Come out, Maya." Carl's voice echoed through the halls, distorted and inhuman. "You can't hide forever." Maya's heart raced as she searched for a way out. The windows were too small, and the door was her only exit. She could hear Carl's footsteps getting closer, the door rattling as he tried to open it. Suddenly, the lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Maya fumbled for her flashlight, her hands shaking as she turned it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it only made her feel more vulnerable. She knew Carl was out there, waiting for her. Just as Carl began banging on the door, Maya spotted the ventilation shaft near the ceiling. It was a tight fit, but it was her only chance. She quickly dragged a chair over and climbed up, unscrewing the grate as fast as her trembling hands would allow. The door rattled violently as Carl's inhuman voice called out to her, his words barely recognizable now. "Come join us, Maya. It's so much easier if you don't fight." With one final push, she slipped into the vent, pulling the grate back into place just as the door burst open. From her vantage point, she could see Carl, or whatever was controlling him, stalking into the room, his glowing eyes scanning the area. He was so close she could hear his ragged breathing, feel the unnatural cold that radiated from him. Maya held her breath, praying he wouldn't notice the vent. After what felt like an eternity, Carl left the room, his footsteps fading as he disappeared into the hallway. But Maya knew it wasn't over. She crawled through the ventilation shaft, her body aching as she tried to stay quiet. Every noise she made seemed amplified in the silence, and she feared that at any moment, Carl would hear her and come after her. Finally, she reached the end of the shaft and kicked open the grate, dropping down into a storage room near the building's exit. The front door was just a few feet away, but she knew Carl was still out there, hunting her. Maya hesitated for a moment, gathering her courage. She knew she couldn't just run. Whatever was possessing Carl wasn't going to stop, and she had to put an end to it. She grabbed a heavy wrench from the storage room and slowly made her way toward the exit. The halls were eerily quiet now, the only sound the soft hum of the building's electrical system. But she could feel it, the presence of something dark and malevolent, watching her from the shadows. As she reached the front door, she heard it, the faint whispering voice from the basement, the same voice Carl had been muttering to. It was coming from behind her. Maya turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. Carl was standing at the end of the hallway, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. But this time, he wasn't alone. The shadowy figure from the mirror was there too, its twisted form towering over him, its eyes burning with an otherworldly hunger. "Join us, Maya," Carl's voice echoed, a twisted smile spreading across his face. Maya gripped the wrench tightly, her knuckles white with fear. She knew she couldn't fight both of them, but she had to try. With a deep breath, she charged forward, swinging the wrench at Carl with all her strength. To her surprise, the blow connected, and Carl collapsed to the ground, unconscious. The shadowy figure let out a low, guttural growl, its form flickering as if it were struggling to maintain its hold on this world. Maya didn't waste any time. She bolted for the exit, throwing open the door and running into the night. By the time the police arrived, Carl was gone. The basement was empty, the mirror shattered, and there was no sign of the shadowy figure. Maya gave her statement, but she knew they didn't believe her. How could they? It all sounded too bizarre, too impossible. But Maya knew what she had seen, and she knew that whatever had been haunting that building wasn't gone. It was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. She quit her job the next day. A week later, as Maya packed up her apartment to move far away from the city, she noticed something strange. In the corner of her bedroom, just out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. The same shadowy figure from the basement, its glowing eyes watching her from the darkness. It was still with her, and this time there was no escaping. It was Sarah's first night working the graveyard shift at an old convenience store, miles away from the nearest town. She wasn't a fan of late nights, but she needed the extra pay. The store had been around for decades, tucked away on a desolate highway with hardly any customers after midnight. Her manager warned her it would be a quiet shift, with the occasional trucker or traveler stopping by. The first few hours passed uneventfully. Sarah browsed through her phone and rearranged shelves out of boredom. But as the clock struck 2 a.m., she noticed something strange. The lights in the back of the store flickered for a brief moment. She brushed it off, thinking it was just an old bulb, and continued with her tasks. But then, a cold draft brushed past her neck, as if someone, or something, had walked right by. "Hello?" she called out, hoping maybe someone had come in unnoticed. No response. Her heart raced, but she tried to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over her. It was just her imagination, she told herself. As she returned to the front counter, she noticed something else. One of the aisles had a shadow, darker than it should have been. It wasn't the kind of shadow you'd expect from the dim lighting. It seemed to move on its own, creeping closer before disappearing the moment Sarah blinked. Goosebumps ran up her arms as she stood frozen in place. Was it the long hours getting to her, or was something lurking in the store? The next night, Sarah arrived at the store feeling a little more prepared. She figured it was all just nerves and fatigue playing tricks on her mind. But something about the store still felt off, like it was watching her. Around midnight, the first customer of the night entered. He was an older man, wearing a tattered coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured most of his face. His steps were slow and deliberate, and as he walked through the aisles, Sarah felt her skin crawl. When he finally reached the counter, he placed a single bottle of water in front of her. "Late night, huh?" She tried to make small talk, but the man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at her with eyes that seemed far too hollow for comfort. He slowly handed her the money, his hands shaking slightly, then turned and left without another word. As she watched him disappear into the night, she realized something strange. The parking lot was empty. There was no car, no sign of how he had arrived or where he had gone. The unease from the previous night returned tenfold. That wasn't the end of it. As the night wore on, a few more customers came in, each one stranger than the last. A woman in an old-fashioned dress who spoke in a whisper, a young man whose eyes were bloodshot and unblinking. None of them seemed right. They all left without a trace, and each time the store grew colder and quieter. By the end of the shift, Sarah could hardly wait to leave. Something was wrong with this place, and she wasn't sure she could handle many more nights like this. On the third night, things escalated. The moment Sarah walked into the store, she felt the suffocating air of dread settle around her. The flickering lights, the cold drafts, the strange customers. Everything was intensifying. Around 3 a.m., the store was completely empty, and Sarah thought maybe she'd get a break from the weirdness. But then she heard it, soft whispering like voices carried on the wind. At first it was too faint to make out, but as she listened closer, the whispers became clearer. Sarah. Her name. It was calling her name. She looked around, panic surging in her chest. No one was there. The store was as empty as ever, but the whispers continued. They came from everywhere, behind the shelves, from the stockroom, even from the walls. "Sarah, we're waiting." Her hands shook as she gripped the counter, trying to steady herself. It was all in her head. It had to be. But the voices grew louder, more insistent. She could feel eyes on her, watching her from the shadows. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, she saw them. Figures standing in the aisles, barely visible in the dim light. They were watching her, waiting for her. In a panic, Sarah grabbed her things and fled the store, locking the doors behind her. She wasn't sure what was happening, but she couldn't stay there anymore. Something evil had taken root in that place. The next day, Sarah did some research on the store, desperate to find answers. She learned that the store had been built on the site of an old farmhouse, long abandoned after a series of mysterious deaths. The owners had vanished without a trace one stormy night, and ever since then, strange occurrences had been reported by anyone who worked or lived near the area. But that wasn't the worst of it. Over the years, several night shift workers had gone missing. Their disappearances never explained. Some said the place was cursed, others believed it was haunted by the spirits of the dead owners. Sarah wasn't sure what to believe, but she knew one thing. Something terrible was happening at that store, and it wasn't just her imagination. Despite her growing fear, Sarah had no choice but to return to work. Bills needed to be paid, and jobs were scarce in the area, so she braced herself for another night in the haunted store. But this time, things were different. From the moment she walked in, she felt the presence of something far darker than before. The air was thick with tension, and the store was unnaturally silent. As the hours passed, the strange occurrences began again. The flickering lights, the cold drafts, the shadows creeping closer. But now the whispering was constant, louder than ever before. "Sarah, join us." She tried to block it out, focusing on her work, but the voices wouldn't stop. They were everywhere, filling her mind with dread. Suddenly, the power went out, plunging the store into darkness. Sarah fumbled for her flashlight, her heart racing as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "Join us." The shadows moved closer, taking shape in the darkness. She could see them now, figures, pale and ghostly, reaching out for her. Sarah knew she couldn't escape. The store was locked and the figures were closing in. She was trapped with the spirits with no way out. In a moment of sheer desperation, she ran to the back of the store, searching for anything that could help her. She found an old storage room hidden behind a stack of boxes and quickly shut herself inside. The whispers were deafening now, pounding in her ears as the shadows clawed at the door. Sarah huddled in the corner, her flashlight flickering, praying for dawn to come. But deep down she knew the truth. There was no escape from the graveyard shift. The spirits had claimed the store, and now they were coming for her. With one final flicker, the flashlight went out and the door creaked open. "Welcome home, Sarah,"